The gold wedding band was a cold, loose circle on Sarah Morgan's finger. 3 months since Thomas was gone, and the Montana winter had whittled her down to bone and grief. Every morning she'd twist the ring, feeling the ghost of his hands, hearing the ghost of his promises. Their homestead, his dream, stood silent, except for the whimpers of the twins. Thomas never even knew he was a father. The letter telling him the news had arrived 2 days after the mine collapsed. She kept it under her pillow, its edges soft from 100 readings, in the hollow where his head should have been. "We'll build something of our own, Sarah," he'd said, his eyes as wide as the Minnesota sky they'd left behind. Something to pass down. Now all she had to pass down were his eyes, clear and blue in the faces of her son, James, and her daughter, Mary. They would never know his laugh, a sound like summer thunder rolling across the prairie. The community had been kind, especially Emma Anderson, whose own children were grown. Emma had been there for the birth, her steady hands guiding 2 new lives into a world of howling December wind. "You're not alone," Emma had said, pressing warm bread into Sarah's hands. But alone was a cold, hard fact in the quiet hours before dawn, when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. The cabin walls felt like they were closing in. The rocking chair he'd made her felt like a throne of sorrow. The trip was a fool's errand. She knew it. But the twins were colicky, and the special tea Emma brewed was nearly gone. More than that, Sarah was fraying. She needed Emma's warmth as much as the babies needed the medicine. "We'll be fine," she whispered to the twins, bundling them in Thomas's old wool scarf. "Your papa used to say there's no weather a body can't handle." She ignored the part of her that screamed he'd said it in July. As she clucked the horse forward, the ring flashed in the weak sun. She could almost hear his voice on the wind. "Be careful, my love. A storm's always closer than you think." She should have listened, because hope is a dangerous thing in a hard country. And her hope was about to lead her and her precious babies straight into the heart of a nightmare. The first snowflakes fell like a lie, soft, innocent, a dusting of sugar on the vast, empty land. Sarah pulled the horse to a stop, her breath a cloud in the sudden chill. Turn back. The thought was a sharp, cold splinter in her mind. But Emma's homestead was just beyond the creek crossing, no more than 3 miles. They were so close. "Just a little further," she murmured, a prayer against the rising wind. The snow wasn't lying anymore. The flakes grew fat and heavy, coming down in a thick white curtain that was swallowing the world. The wagon wheels groaned, fighting the gathering drifts. She should have worried about the wheels. A broken axle, a split spoke. But the wheels held firm. They gave no warning at all. The creek in summer was a gentle thing, barely deep enough to cool a horse's fetlocks. In winter it kept secrets. Dark, cold secrets, hidden under a thin skin of snow-dusted ice. The first crack was a whisper, a shiver she felt through the floorboards of the wagon. The second was a gunshot. Time stretched thin. She watched, helpless, as a spiderweb of fractures raced across the ice, white lines against the black, hungry water beneath. The horse screamed, a sound of pure terror that ripped the twins from their sleep. Sarah had one heartbeat, one single precious moment to clutch her babies tighter before the world fell away. The right side of the wagon plunged through the ice. A spray of frozen shards glittered in the failing light like a shower of broken diamonds. Cold, a cold so absolute, so violent, it felt like a physical blow. It slammed into her, stealing her breath as the icy water surged over the wagon side. Her heavy skirts drank the water, trying to pull her down into the dark. But a mother's arms are stronger than anything. She scrambled, pushing off the sinking wagon, her feet finding the tilting seat. The twins' cries were thin, sharp blades in the freezing air. She stumbled onto the cracking ice, each step a prayer, each groan of the ice beneath her feet a lifetime of fear. The horse thrashed behind her. She didn't look back. Couldn't. Every ounce of her being was focused on the 2 precious lives she held against her heart. She made it 10 steps toward the bank before her legs gave out. The bank was so close, a lifetime away. She collapsed to her knees in the deepening snow, curling her body into a shield around the twins. "Shh, my loves," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "Mama's got you." Her frozen fingers fumbled with the ties of her cloak, instinct taking over. Get them warm. Protect them. The lantern. The thought cut through the fog of her mind like a sliver of sun. It had survived, still hanging from its hook. She reached for it, a sob of relief catching in her throat as her fingers closed around its familiar weight. The matches in her pocket, wrapped in waxed paper, were dry. It took 3 tries, her fingers clumsy and numb. Then a tiny flame bloomed in the glass, a pitifully small glow against the roaring dark. But it was something, a beacon, a final, desperate declaration that they were still alive. Time dissolved. It was measured now only in the weakening cries of her babies and the slow, steady dimming of the lantern's flame. She tried to pray, but the words were snatched away by the wind. Instead, she whispered Thomas's name, a litany against the end. "Thomas, watch over them. Thomas, send someone." The wind howled back, driving snow under her cloak. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. The numbness was a terrifying predator, creeping up her legs. The twins had fallen quiet, too quiet. She forced her wooden fingers to touch their cheeks. A faint stir, relief, hot and sharp, flooded through her. "Stay with me, little ones," she pleaded, "just a little longer." But her own strength was a guttering candle flame. The lantern's light danced, and she saw Thomas's eyes, the way they used to sparkle when he smiled. The last thing she remembered was a sound. Not the storm, something else. Something rhythmic, carried on the wind. Hoofbeats, or maybe just her desperate mind, playing its last trick. She pulled her babies closer, pressing her lips to their foreheads, and whispered it one last time. To them, to herself, to the dying light. Just a little longer. John Hawkins didn't trust this storm. 20 years of reading this territory, and he could feel it in his bones. This one had teeth. The 3 head of cattle he was tracking for the Anderson Ranch had wandered into the worst possible country, straight for the creek crossings. He pulled out the old map his father had given him. "The territory's got its own language, son," the old man had said. "Learn to read it, and it'll never lead you wrong." The map was covered in his father's spidery notes, decades of wisdom inked in the margins. He traced the creek's path. Emma Anderson's place was just beyond it. He'd used the missing cattle as an excuse to check on her. The other ranchers teased him about his visits to the widow, but Emma had been like a mother to him since his own had passed. His horse chief snorted, restless. He knew too. The cattle tracks were fading fast. John didn't need them. He could read the bend of a branch, the depth of a drift. His father called it having snow in your blood. John just called it listening, and today the land was screaming a warning. Chief's ears pricked forward. John reined him in, listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the crack of a freezing tree limb. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. A sound that tugged at his memory, a ghost from a long-ago storm. He checked the map again. The creek crossing was less than a mile ahead. His father's note by the creek was stark. Ice never tells the whole truth. Better a long detour than a short funeral. The sound came again. Closer. Chief shifted, alert. The sensible thing was to turn back. Head for his cabin. No one expected a man to save every stray in a blizzard. Emma would understand. But that sound. It wasn't an animal. It was human. It was desperation. His father's voice seemed to whisper from the map. The territory tests a man's character most when the choice is hardest. He clicked his tongue, guiding Chief forward. Straight into the teeth of the storm. The cattle would have to wait. Something else was calling him to that creek. Something the territory was telling him in its own brutal language. Someone was out there, and they were running out of time. It wasn't a sound that guided him next. It was a light, a faint golden glow, flickering through the wall of white, a fallen star in a sea of snow. His gut clenched. A lantern. No sane person would be out here with a lantern, which meant they were desperate, or worse. Chief picked his way forward, sensing his rider's urgency. The ground began to slope downward. The creek bank. John almost missed her. A dark shape. a shadow against the swirling snow, huddled at the edge of the broken ice. His heart stopped. For a second, he was 20 years old again, in another storm, another failed rescue, finding his own mother frozen solid by the barn when the spring thaw finally came. "Hello!" His voice was swallowed by the storm. "Hold on! I'm coming!" The shadow moved, just a fraction, but she was alive. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the snow. 10 feet away, he saw it. She wasn't alone. She was cradling something. Not one bundle, but two. Sarah heard the voice through a thick fog. It couldn't be real. The hoofbeats, the voice. They were just dreams at the edge of the darkness. She forced her head up. A massive shape loomed out of the blizzard. A horse and rider, solid and real. An answer to a prayer she didn't know she had the strength to make. "Can you stand?" The man's voice was gentle but hard with urgency. She tried to answer, but her lips were frozen. She shook her head, a tiny, jerky movement. He didn't waste another second. He swung down from his horse, his face grim. Her skirts were frozen solid to the ground. Her hands, clutched around the babies, had the waxy, dead look of severe frostbite. When he reached for the twins, her arms locked like iron, a primal, animal strength. "I won't hurt them," he said, his eyes meeting hers. They were gray, like the storm. "But we have to move, now. My cabin's not far." Something in his gaze, something beyond the cold resolve, made her loosen her grip. He lifted all three of them in one motion, a bundle of frozen cloth and fading life. Getting them onto the horse was a clumsy, desperate struggle. The big animal stood like a rock. John swung up behind them, his arm a band of steel around her, holding them all secure against his warmth. The lantern sputtered, hissed, and died, plunging them into darkness. He gathered the reins, his body a shield against the wind. Chief knew the way home. He had to. Their tracks were already gone. Sarah drifted, anchored only by the heat at her back and the weight of her children. Was this real? The sway of the horse, the man's voice rumbling close to her ear. "Stay with me. What's your name?" "See, Sarah." Her own voice was a stranger's. "Morgan." The effort sent a violent shiver through her. A good sign. Her body was fighting back. "I'm John Hawkins," he said. "The babies?" "James," she whispered. "And Mary." Saying their names was like striking a match in her frozen mind. "Are they—" "They're breathing," he said. But she heard the worry in his voice. They were too quiet, too still. "Thomas," she murmured, the memory of her husband rising up. He said, "A storm's always closer." "Save your strength, Sarah," John interrupted, his voice rough. "Just hold on to those babies." She sagged against him, consciousness fraying. Every hoofbeat was a second stolen back from the storm. Somewhere ahead was a cabin, a fire, life. But the storm was a living thing, and it didn't want to let them go. John Hawkins, who hadn't prayed in 20 years, found himself whispering into the wind, begging a God he'd long forgotten to guide them home. The horse blanket was all he could spare. He worked it free from under the saddle, his movements sure and practiced, never loosening his grip on Sarah and the twins. The wool was warm from the horse's body, a small, vital gift. He draped it around her, tucking it tight. "Chief here won't mind sharing," he said, his voice loud against the wind, trying to keep her tethered to the world. Sarah's shivers were violent now, her whole body shaking against him. It was a good sign, a terrible sign. Her body was burning its last fuel to stay alive. The twins were what scared him. They hadn't made a sound. "Tell me about them," he urged. "How old?" 2 weeks, she managed through chattering teeth. "Needed Emma's tea." It clicked. Emma Anderson. She'd been making a desperate run for a neighbor's help. Foolish. Brave. Chief stumbled, catching himself on the edge of a deep drift. John's heart hammered against his ribs. They were close. He could feel it. The shape of the land, the way the wind changed. The aspens that marked the trail to his cabin had to be here somewhere. "Nearly there," he promised, more to himself than to her. Sarah's head lolled against his chest. One of the twins made a tiny sound, a faint puff of air. In that moment, with the world erased by snow, Holding the lives of a stranger and her two infants in his arms, John had never felt so alone. "Stay with me, Sarah Morgan," he said, his voice raw. "Think about summer. Think about a warm fire." He described his cabin, the thick walls, the stone hearth with coals banked deep. He told her about the quilt on his bed, stitched by his mother's hands, its patterns telling stories he'd traced as a boy. He didn't know if she could hear him. He didn't care. He kept talking, weaving a lifeline of words in the darkness. Then Chief's stride became certain. The wind's howl lessened. A dark shape solidified out of the swirling white. The cabin. "Home," he breathed, the word a prayer. "We're home, Sarah." The next few minutes were a frantic blur, getting them down from the horse, kicking the frozen door open with his shoulder, his arms still full. Inside, the only light was the faint red glow from the hearth. He laid Sarah on the bed on his mother's quilt and unwrapped the twins. They whimpered, their tiny faces pale but pink. She had saved them, with the last of her own fading warmth. He worked with grim efficiency, wood on the coals, the bellows pumping, flames leaping to life. Her clothes had to come off. They were a shell of ice. He worked fast, peeling away the frozen layers, keeping her covered with the quilt. He wrapped the twins in his own flannel shirts and laid them beside her. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, in the small circle of firelight, a man he didn't recognize anymore fought for 3 lives he hadn't known existed an hour ago. His father had always said the territory makes you who you are. As he tucked the quilt around Sarah and her babies, John realized the territory had just remade him completely. The fire was the heart of their world. John fed it the good oak he'd been saving for the dead of winter. This, he figured, was as dead as it gets. "Come on, Sarah," he murmured, chafing her hands. They felt like frozen twigs. The twins, nestled in a cradle of blankets near the hearth, were starting to cry. Weakly, but it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. He knew what to do for frostbite. Warm water, never hot. He tested every drop on his own wrist before starting the slow, painful process of bringing her hands and feet back to life. "You have to fight," he told her, still form. "Those babies need their mother." The first sign of returning color brought a gasp. Her eyes flew open, wild with fear and confusion. "The twins!" Her voice was a raw croak. "Where are my babies?" "Right here," he soothed, helping her turn her head. "They're safe." Just then, James let out a proper, lusty wail. Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks. "They're alive," she whispered. "You kept them alive," he said, his voice firm. "You did everything right." She tried to flex her fingers and cried out in pain. "They're on fire." "That's good," he said. "It means the feeling is coming back." He watched the twins. They'd need to eat soon, but their mother had to be strong enough to hold them first. The cabin grew warmer, a tiny pocket of safety carved out of the storm. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice stronger. "My cabin, about halfway between your place and Emma Anderson's." "You know Emma? She's been like a mother to me." He carefully lifted Mary, who was starting to fuss, and brought her to Sarah. "Think you can hold her?" Her movements were clumsy, but her eyes were fierce with a mother's resolve. He helped her position the baby against her chest. The sight of them there, in the firelight, stirred an old, deep ache in his heart. An ache he thought he'd buried for good. "Thank you," she whispered, her gaze locked on her daughter. He brought James to her other arm. The twins, feeling their mother's warmth, immediately began rooting for food. Sarah's cheeks flushed. "Could you turn away?" John busied himself with the fire, giving her privacy. The simple sounds of a mother feeding her children filled the silence. It was a warmth the fire couldn't touch. "Never thought I'd be grateful for lost cattle," he said to the flames. "That's what brought me out your way." There was a long pause, then a quiet laugh that surprised them both. "You can turn around now." She looked exhausted, but more alert. The firelight glinted off her wedding ring. He knew that look, the look of someone who carries their ghost with them everywhere they go. "You should rest," he said, pulling another blanket over her and the sleeping twins. "The storm will keep us holed up for a day or two." Her eyes were already closing. "Won't you be cold?" she murmured. "I've weathered worse," he said, settling into his father's old rocking chair. "Sleep now. You're safe." Sarah drifted off, her children held close. John watched them, the firelight playing on their faces. His solitary cabin, a place of silence and memory, was suddenly a sanctuary, a shelter for new life, and for a hope he hadn't realized he'd lost. Dawn found John by the fire, the smell of strong coffee filling the small cabin. It was a ritual, a connection to his past. His mother had taught him to make it, strong enough to float a horseshoe. The dented copper pot had been hers. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening slowly. The confusion was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. "Is that real coffee?" she asked. "The realest," he said, bringing her a cup. She took it, her hands steadier now. The tips of her fingers were tender and pink, but the worst of the frostbite was gone. "Thank you," she said, and he knew she meant for more than the coffee. "Storm's still blowing," he told her, "but the worst is past. We'll be stuck here another day at least." She took a sip, closing her eyes. "Perfect. I haven't had proper coffee since Thomas." Her eyes opened, meeting his. "I suppose you're wondering what kind of fool takes two newborns out in a blizzard." "Reckon I'm not the judging type," he said quietly. "I'm more wondering how you kept them alive." Her smile was sudden and warm. "I just held on." She looked down at the cup. "Emma has been so kind since the accident." "I heard about that," he said gently. "Word travels. I'm sorry for your loss." "As I am for yours," she replied, and his head snapped up in surprise. She nodded toward his eyes. "There's a look. Grief recognizes its own." Before he could respond, James woke with a sharp cry. Sarah set her coffee aside and lifted him, her movements more certain now. John turned away to give her privacy, checking his supplies. They had plenty of flour and dried beef. But the twins. "I hear you thinking," Sarah said after a moment. "And no, we won't starve you out of house and home." He turned back, a smile touching his lips. "Wasn't worried about that. Was thinking I might need to shovel a path to the barn. See about that milk cow of mine." "You have a milk cow?" Relief washed over her face. "Old Bessie. Mostly for my own coffee, but I reckon she won't mind sharing." He watched her soothe James. "You taking strays often?" "Mostly the four-legged kind," he admitted. He looked around the cabin at the sudden life filling its quiet corners. "It's a good life, but quiet. Sometimes the silence is a comfort," she said softly, "and sometimes it gets too loud." He knew exactly what she meant. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding of two souls who knew the weight of solitude all too well. "Tell me about him," John said quietly. "Thomas." Her face softened. "He had dreams bigger than the sky. This homestead, it was just the beginning." She looked down at the baby in her arms. "He would have been a wonderful father." "He chose well," John said, his voice rough. "Chose a woman strong enough to carry his dreams on." "Strong?" Her laugh was brittle. "I almost got us all killed yesterday." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You faced down a blizzard and a frozen river to get help for your babies. When disaster struck, you didn't panic. You built a shelter, you lit a lantern, and you held on. That's not weakness, Sarah. That's the kind of strength that built this whole territory." A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. The storm outside was dying, but in the quiet warmth of the cabin, something new and fragile was just beginning to stir. The photograph was tucked behind a sack of flour, as if hidden on purpose. Sarah found it by accident. She'd insisted on helping with a meal, needing to feel useful. Her hand brushed against the worn cardboard. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to put it back. "Don't be," John said quietly from behind her. "Haven't looked at that in years." Well, he took it from her. A young couple stood before the cabin. This cabin. The woman, with a tentative smile, had one hand on her rounded belly. The man beside her was a younger John, his eyes bright with a hope that pierced Sarah's heart. "Catherine," John said, his voice thick. "My wife." His thumb brushed over the image. "She died that winter. Her and the baby. The snows came early." Sarah's hand went to his arm, a simple, instinctive touch of shared sorrow. "What was she like?" He seemed surprised by the question. "She loved music, sang all the time, followed me out here from Boston with nothing but faith. Said if she was going to live in this cabin, she ought to have a hand in building it. His face grew distant. We had plans, a whole house full of kids, a piano. What happened? Sarah asked softly. Childbirth, he said, the word blunt and hard. Doctor couldn't get through the storm. I did. Everything I knew how. But it wasn't enough. He drew a shuddering breath. Been just me ever since. Is that why you were out there yesterday? Sarah asked, a sudden insight striking her. Looking for others? He met her eyes, startled. Maybe. Never thought of it that way, but maybe. He put the photograph carefully back in its hiding place. They worked in a comfortable silence, preparing the meal. But the silence was different now. It was filled with the ghosts they both carried. As the cabin filled with the scent of cornbread, Sarah found herself watching his hands. Strong hands that had built this home, that had saved her life. Kinda nice having people to feed, he said, catching her gaze. Kinda nice not being alone, she replied softly. Mary woke with a fuss, and John had a clean cloth ready before Sarah could even ask. He moved with a quiet competence, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. As they sat down to eat, the last of the storm whining outside, Sarah studied his face. The young man from the photograph was still there, but loss had carved new lines, etched a hard-won wisdom in his eyes. Just then, both twins woke at once, their cries filling the cabin. John rose automatically to help. His hand brushed hers as he passed her a blanket. The brief contact was like a spark, an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and she found herself wondering what Catherine would think of this good, quiet man who had turned his lonely refuge into a sanctuary for a widow and her two babies. He kept the carved wooden toys in an old trunk at the foot of his bed. A horse, a bear, a bird with its wings spread for flight. They were worn smooth with time, and something that looked like hope. Made these a long time ago, he said, a faint flush on his cheeks. Was practicing for someday. Sarah didn't need him to finish the sentence. They were for the child he'd lost, dreams carved into wood. They're beautiful, she said, her fingers tracing the horse's mane. Mary, in her lap, reached a tiny, grasping hand toward the horse. They might be a bit young for toys, John said. They're never too young for beauty, she replied, or for the sound of your voice. They settle right down whenever you talk. It was true. His deep, calm voice was a balm to them. She'd watched him earlier, walking the cabin with James, telling the infant about the tools on the wall as if sharing the world's great secrets. The compliment seemed to catch him off guard. You're the one with the magic touch, and he said, the way you are with them, like you're whispering with angels. Tears pricked her eyes. Thomas had never seen her be a mother. This near stranger saw it all. Later, as darkness fell, she asked him to read aloud from a worn book of poetry she'd seen on a shelf. It was his mother's. He read Wordsworth, his voice filling the cabin, weaving a spell of peace. The twins grew still, their eyes fixed on his face. When one started to fuss for a feeding, they switched babies with an easy, practiced grace, as if they'd been doing this together for years. You would have been a wonderful father, John, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He didn't flinch. He just smiled, a sad, accepting smile. Life has its own plans, but having these little ones here, it's a glimpse of what might have been. He looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms. They're lucky to have a mother strong enough to get them through anything. We were luckier, she said, her voice barely a whisper, to find someone strong enough to save us. Their eyes met over the sleeping children. The carved toys sat on the table between them, silent testaments to a dream deferred. But as the firelight danced on the walls, Sarah wondered if dreams ever really died, or if sometimes they just waited for a second chance to be born. The words were written in his mother's elegant script, in a diary tucked inside an old Bible. Love comes twice blessed when it arrives in winter's depths. Sarah hadn't meant to pry, but the open page seemed to speak directly to the feelings she'd been trying to ignore. Feelings that grew every time she saw John with her children. Found my mother's journal, John's voice said from behind her. She jumped. I'm sorry, No need, he said, coming to stand beside her at the window. She always said words were for sharing. He glanced at the page. That was from the winter she met my father. A blizzard trapped them together at a church social. She believed everything happened for a reason, he said softly. Even the hard things. He paused. Even losing Catherine. And do you believe that? Sarah asked. I didn't. For a long, long time. His eyes, gray as a winter sky, met hers. But lately, I've been starting to wonder. The sleeping twins were tiny angels in their cradle. Sarah was intensely aware of him standing so close, his warmth a comfort against the cold glass of the window. Thomas used to say the heart was meant to multiply love, not divide it, she said, her voice quiet. Catherine said it was like a lamp, he murmured. Sharing its light doesn't make the flame any smaller. The snow swirled outside, a gentle dance now. The storm had passed. I never thought I'd feel this way again, Sarah whispered, the confession hanging in the air. It feels disloyal. He turned to face her. Sarah, there is no disloyalty in healing, or in finding room in your heart for new love, right alongside the old. Is that what this is? She asked, her breath catching. Love. I think, he said slowly, his gaze steady, it's the beginning of something that could be, if we're brave enough. Mary stirred, and they moved together to check on her, their hands brushing as they adjusted her blanket. The touch was electric. I'm not ready, she admitted. It's all so fast. Nothing has to be decided today, he assured her, his voice a gentle rumble. Or tomorrow. We have time. Winter's long in Montana. She found herself smiling. They did have time. Time to heal. Time to let this fragile, beautiful thing between them grow. She closed the diary, but the words were burned into her mind. Love comes twice blessed when it arrives in winter's depths. Looking at John's face in the fading light, at the man who had ridden out of a storm and into her heart, she finally understood. The message clattered across the telegraph wires just as the sky began to clear. Found Sarah. Stop. Twins safe. Stop. At Hawkins' cabin. Stop. Emma Anderson clutched the yellow paper, tears of relief carving paths through the flour on her cheeks. She'd been sick with worry, imagining the worst. Thank the Lord for John Hawkins, she whispered, already barking orders. Within an hour, the entire territory was mobilizing. Back at the cabin, they were unaware of the cavalry about to descend. Their world had shrunk to the fussy cries of the twins and the dwindling supply of Emma's colic tea. Help's coming, John assured her, though he had no way of knowing for sure. Then they heard it, a distant muffled sound, the sound of many horses plowing through deep snow. John grabbed his rifle out of habit and went to the window. A slow grin spread across his face. Well, I'll be, he muttered. Looks like the whole neighborhood is coming to call. A long line of riders was approaching, leading pack horses laden with supplies. At their head, sitting straight and proud in her saddle, was Emma Anderson. The cabin, once a haven of solitude, was suddenly bursting with life. Neighbors poured in, bearing food, blankets, and a milk cow, led by a shy young man named Tommy. You did right, John Hawkins, Emma declared, her sharp eyes taking in everything. She looked from John to Sarah to the twins, and a knowing twinkle appeared in her gaze. Though next time you decide to take in a whole family, you might send word a bit sooner. The way she said family made Sarah blush. She could already hear the gossip spreading across the territory. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain, but then she caught John's eye across the crowded room. He smiled, a quiet, steady smile that said everything. And Sarah realized the gossips wouldn't be wrong. Not entirely. Something profound had happened in this snowbound cabin. Not a scandal, a miracle. Emma seemed to read her thoughts. The older woman squeezed her hand. Sometimes, she said softly, God sends a storm just to blow us exactly where we need to be. The sun broke through the clouds, flooding the cabin with brilliant light. Surrounded by the warmth of her community, watching the man who had saved her moving through the crowd, Sarah had a thought that was so sudden and clear it stole her breath. This feels like home. 2 weeks later, the plans for her new homestead were spread across Emma's kitchen table. John had drawn them himself, spending his evenings sketching out a bigger, stronger house. A larger window for the morning sun, a covered porch, a second bedroom for when the twins were older. "John, this is too much," Sarah whispered, her voice thick. "Folks here take care of their own," Emma said gruffly from the stove. John's daily visits had become a fixture. He arrived each day with new ideas, small improvements. A deeper root cellar that could double as a storm shelter. His memory of finding them in the blizzard was a ghost that drove him to build a fortress for her. Just then, a new sound filled the air. Wagons approaching. Men from all over were arriving with lumber and stone, ready to start the build as soon as the spring thaw came. The homestead, once a place of lonely grief, was now a hub of bustling activity and communal purpose. "Never seen him like this," Emma commented to Sarah, as they watched John directing the unloading. "Always kept to himself before." "He's just being kind," Sarah said, though her heart knew it was more. "That man isn't thinking of you as just a neighbor, Sarah Morgan," Emma said, her voice gentle but firm. "And it's all right to be happy again. Thomas would have wanted that." Sarah looked out the window. John had finished and was walking back toward the house. He moved with a quiet confidence, a man remade. When his eyes met hers through the glass, they held a question that made her heart leap. The plans on the table were more than just lines on paper. They were a promise, a foundation for a new house and a new life. He brought her a packet of morning glory seeds. "Found these in town," he said, as they sat on Emma's porch. "Thought you might want to plan your garden." The spring thaw had arrived early, and construction on her house was well underway. "Thomas tried to grow these our first year," Sarah said, a soft, wistful smile on her face. "They never took." She looked up at him, her eyes clear with a new kind of hope. Maybe this time they will. Their relationship had grown slowly, steadily, like the house rising from the new foundation. A shared look, a lingering touch, a comfortable silence. "He'll always be their father," John said one afternoon, his hand covering hers. They'd been talking about Thomas. "Just like Catherine will always be a part of me. Doesn't mean there's no room for new love to grow." The word hung in the air between them. Love. Later, as they fed the twins, Sarah looked at the life they were already building, the easy way they moved around each other, anticipating each other's needs. "I was so focused on just surviving," she said, "that I forgot to look for beauty." She nodded at the seed packets. "I forgot that life needs more than just the needful things." "Beauty is needful," John said quietly. "It feeds the soul." Mary's tiny hand curled around his finger, and Sarah watched his whole face soften. Spring was a time for new beginnings, and sitting there, with the man who had saved them and the children who had given them both a second chance, Sarah felt the seeds of her own heart taking root and reaching for the sun. The deeds to their two properties lay side by side on the new kitchen table. Her land, with its better soil, his, with the stronger barn. "This land was Thomas's dream," she said softly. "And you've honored it," John replied, his hand covering hers. "But whatever we decide now, it has to be for us." She laced her fingers with his. "What if we didn't have to choose?" He looked at her confused. "Our lands share a boundary," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Together, they'd be one of the largest spreads in the territory. Room for cattle and crops, room for our family to grow." The word "our" settled between them. He stood, pulling her to her feet. "Sarah Morgan," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I suppose I am," she whispered. His laugh was rough. "Reckon you beat me to it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a single pearl. "It was my mother's. Been carrying this for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment." Instead of answering, he kissed her. Their first kiss, as sweet and sure as spring rain. "That's a yes," he said when they finally parted. Looking down at her hand, where the pearl ring now sat beside Thomas's simple gold band, Sarah felt no conflict, only a deep, abiding gratitude for the storm that had blown her life apart, only to piece it back together, stronger and more beautiful than before. They were married exactly 1 year after the storm. Snow fell softly outside, but the house was filled with warmth and laughter. The twins, now a year old, toddled among the guests, the undisputed rulers of the celebration. By the power vested in me, Reverend Miller declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Their kiss was a promise sealed in front of the community that had become their family. Later, raising a glass, Emma Anderson's voice rang out. To the Double Heart Ranch, may it always be a testament to how much love can overcome. That night, as the last of the guests departed, John and Sarah stood on the porch, watching the snow fall. Hard to believe it's been a year, she said, leaning against him. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, he replied, his arm tightening around her. And sometimes it feels like I've known you my whole life. He turned her to face him. Thank you, he said, for teaching me that love can come again. And thank you, she whispered, for saving us. A sleepy cry came from the nursery upstairs. Duty calls, Mrs. Hawkins, John smiled. She took his offered arm. Lead the way, Mr. Hawkins. Together they went inside to tend to their children, their future stretching out before them, as bright and promising as the fresh, new snow. If this story of hope and second chances touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe because you won't want to miss the incredible story we have for you tomorrow.